been hanging out in South Asia.
How are your travels?
They were good, yeah.
Yeah?
I only got the chopped one.
That's not bad.
No, it is not bad at all.
Sensational. That's what you told me. That's what you told me. I'm going to go sit down, like there.
This is for a seasoned old hack.
How you guys doing? I got like by the mic, like I've got a question I know I want to ask right from the beginning. I've actually never asked this question in a forum before. It's like a thing I need to tick off the bucket list before I leave. Oh, the event about American football? Yeah. I think they just like ask a random person about American football.
What do you see the implications of NFL?
I'm gonna go sit down. See you guys in a bit. See you guys in a bit.
Yeah, I need to get signed up. She offered to bring 50 people.
Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Kiana Rauji. I'm a first year at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live, which is also listed in your program. And you can also follow us on Instagram at JFK Junior Forum. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming tonight's guests and Harvard Kennedy School student Fadi Sayam.
MP student at Harvard Kennedy School. So let's start with this. By show of hands, do you think that artificial intelligence will leave almost everyone unemployed?
Oh, good.
Very few, very few. So, and if yes, then when? Is the universal basic income a good fix for this issue? What kind of skills employees should maintain to survive in a world run by robots? All these questions will be discussed in our panel today. So, the Future Society Student Organization at HKS and the Digital HKS, an independent project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, which, by the way, was recently named #1 university-affiliated think tank for the 6th year in a row, are organizing this panel for tonight. Also, I have to mention that we'll be launching a study group at the end of March to learn about the topics that will be discussed today. The study group will be run by Professor David Eaves and Professor Jason Furman. If you're interested in joining the study group, please don't forget to submit an application using the link included in the brochure of tonight's event. It's on the 3rd page in the bottom right. Special thanks to my friend and partner in crime, Brian Carter, an MPP student at HKS. We worked really hard for the last 4 months to prepare for this panel and the study group. And special thanks also to Vanessa Ryan-Smith, the Associate Director at Digital HKS. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Professor David Eaves. Professor Eaves is a public policy entrepreneur and an expert in information technology and government. He's also Faculty Director at Digital HKS and lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel.
Welcome everybody for coming out, especially on a day that is not the warmest that we've had so far in Cambridge. I'm really excited about this panel. It's been in the works for several months. When we took the vote initially here, when people said, are you worried about all the jobs disappearing because of automation AI? A lot of confidence in the room that people's jobs aren't going to go away. I think that's nice to see on one level, but I think it's also not necessarily reflective of how many in the public see this conversation, and I think a certain level of anxiety that exists out there about the future of work and the types of jobs that will exist for people. And so part of this panel is to think about what those anxieties are they real, are they well-founded, are they not? And then more importantly, what are we as a society, what can we do and what should we do to create a future that we want to work in and that serves us, not just financially, but kind of nurtures us as a society and as individuals so that we can lead full and complete lives. So let's not just talk about how we create work, let's talk about how we create meaningful work and create a meaningful community. I'm overjoyed today to be joined by my panelists. Jason Furman, I've now known for a few years, a huge addition to the school. Obviously a faculty member, a professor here, but also had a role in the Obama administration as the president's economic advisor, and has been thinking about these types of issues for a while now, and is joining me for the reading group that we do on kind of the digital economy. Immediately to my left is Mary Gray. Mary is at Microsoft, the research center there, also faculty at Indiana University, and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center. The list goes on. Also, very importantly, has a forthcoming book on ghost work that is coming out, I believe, in May, that we're going to talk to you very briefly about. And then finally, esteemed the dean and professor over at Brandeis at the School of Social Policy and Management, David Weil, has joined us, coming up from Washington, where he just landed in time, so we're very grateful he could make it in time. So these are our panelists. What I'd first like to do is open up, maybe first with you, Mary. Tell me a little bit about your book, Ghost Work. What are we dealing with here in kind of automation, AI, and the future of work? What do you think that means, and how are you seeing it, and how are you describing it?
Sure.
The book is called Ghost Work, and the subtitle is fairly important. It's How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass. It was co-authored with Siddharth Suri, who's a computer scientist, a fellow researcher at Microsoft Research in the New York City lab. And if you had asked a room full of technologists this same question, I'm pretty sure everybody's hand would have gone up. So importantly, within the valley and within kind of the heart center of places where people are convinced that, in the best sense, if they build technologies, they'll land in the world and they'll do good things, most of those folks feel like getting rid of drudgery is a good thing. Who would want to have to pick up trash or deliver food or do some basic things that we today associate with on-demand economies, with service work? So the book was really an investigation of a growing world of work that most of us cannot see. It's the people who effectively train data that makes your life better. So internet searches, content moderation, which is a little more familiar to people now, a range of work like captioning and subtitling that isn't simple, but is precisely the kind of work that's technically very hard to automate. And this world of work is mostly done by people around the globe. We studied India and the United States. We looked at 4 different platform companies that distribute this kind of work. And this is anything that can be, at least in part, sourced, managed, scheduled, shipped, and billed through an application programming interface, the internet, and a little bit of a sprinkle of artificial intelligence. If you put it in those terms, that is a lot of work. And it's, again, work none of us really see moving through the internet. But importantly, it's growing. It's effectively replacing staffing, temp work. It's information services work. So looking at the people who do this kind of task-based driven work that's often pennies a pop in India and the United States was a way to get at what do the people who do this work for, who they do it with, and what are the things they find meaningful about it.
Interesting. David, the poll here suggested that people are not concerned about the end of work. And there is actually a history of literature, Luddites, and then there was a book written called The End of Work, I think 25 years ago. We've kind of heard this concern arise before. Is this time a different? Like, are we looking at a future right now where we won't have anything to do and we'll be all sitting back and, in an ideal world, sipping martinis in a terrible world, all destitute and poor? Is that imminent?
Right. We should all live so long to live in that world. I mean, if you look back at every time there's been a major new technology that's about to move into the workplace, you get similar language. Oh no, this time is really different. I was given at a conference I was at about 6 months ago a front page LA Times story that talked about Governor Brown convening a major meeting of academics and industry and union people to talk about what to do about the problem of automation and mechanization. The issue was it wasn't Governor Jerry Brown who was convening it, it was Governor Edmund Brown, his father, in 1964 or something like that. And so I think we always overplay, partly because it's hard to know what the next generation of automation is going to do to employment, about its impacts. I think what we often do at the same time, and I think it's true in this instant as well, we underplay the social choices that are embedded in how a new technology or technologies roll out. And because of that, we can get stuck in a kind of determinism that we need to get out of the way and let these things play. And then we're in kind of a cleanup phase where we're not trying to think proactively about some of the impacts of technology and what are basic principles, for instance, in the workplace we're trying to preserve. And I'll say this, as we discussed, we can talk about this more. I served in the Obama administration with Jason. I was at the Labor Department, and I was the head of the Wage and Hour Division, and our whole task was to enforce our basic labor policies in this in this country. And I was there at a time that the platforms were exploding. So I saw firsthand some of the impacts about where we don't get in front and have principled discussions about what are we trying to preserve and how does that fit into an emerging technology, AI, robotics, platforms, and so on. And I think that's, again, one of the biggest issues facing us.
Okay. Jason, maybe, if the robots were taking over, there'd probably be some evidence of that. And particularly, you'd probably see some economic evidence like surging unemployment, maybe massively increased productivity. Are we seeing those things?
Right. Yeah, so I don't think there's any reason to think this time is different. We all have our favorite newspaper headlines. Mine is from a Wall Street Journal story about how there's a new danger that robots are getting so sophisticated that they're going to take all the jobs, not just here on Earth, but in outer space. And this article was written in 1960. So we've always had these worries. They've never materialized. I don't see it happening right now because if it was, what you'd see is not a lot of people working, but a lot of output. And productivity is the amount of output per hour. So you'd see productivity soaring. Instead, we're seeing the opposite, really disappointing GDP growth, really disappointing aggregate output, but decent job gains every month. So I think we're seeing the opposite of what you would expect to see if this was the case. Let me just say, though, that this time isn't different doesn't give me any degree of reassurance at all, because we handled a lot of the previous ones quite badly. And we saw employment rates slipping and falling over a long period of time, inequality rising over a long period of time. So I think rather than being worried about this time being different as some existential threat, we need to be thinking what we can do in terms of public policy to actually make this time different so we don't get the falling employment rates, so we don't get the rising inequality. Because I think this time being the same is something that we should actually be worried about.
So maybe as a kind of follow-up to that, one of the things, David, you and I had talked about earlier today was, you were looking at some of the adverse early kind of policy moves that some of the platforms were making, some of the players were making themselves, and in particular, I think you mentioned like the kind of the handy laws.
Right.
Maybe so first up, let me just say, like the robots do not appear to be taking over imminently, but there's still a threat that there is something happening that has us concerned and that we need to be engaged on. What is the problem? Maybe just talk a little bit about what are you seeing from a policy perspective, some of the challenges that are coming our way?
So there's a specific one, I'll talk to the platform, but even there for a while, I'm sure everyone on this panel has been to what a friend of mine calls the future of work industrial complex. There is just endless discussions about the future of work and convenings around them and discussions around them, and they are invariably focused solely on platforms and platform-related
because I haven't been to any of those this week.
You have not to this week. Yeah, that's right.
I was at one.
I missed you at the one this week.
Yeah.
And there have been measures. Larry Katz here at Harvard, Alan Kruger have done estimates about the size of that, and I think most estimates that people are coming up with is that it's less than 1% of the workforce who are really being deployed on platforms at this moment, although I think that is growing and is growing rapidly. So the bigger issue I would tie the platform issue to, that I think we need to be very concerned about, and it's the present of work. It's something in my own work I've called the fissured workplace, and that is a much longer term trend of breaking apart the activities of business organizations who retain control over the outcomes of those core businesses. And yet a lot of the activities, beginning with more mundane kinds of activities, but increasingly things closer and closer to the core of what businesses do, are shifted out through subcontracting, through third-party management systems, through franchising as a response. And that has implications in terms of the quality of work, the compliance with labor laws, even the prevention of health and safety problems, that I think is a big issue that we have to deal with. And it's certainly very related in my mind to growing income inequality. The specific issue that you're raising is something that, again, I saw as not as an academic but as a regulator when the platform started to explode in size. A lot of them set themselves up with the presumption that anyone working on a platform was an independent contractor. And our public policies sort of allowed that. I think some of the companies involved were very artful in getting out there quickly and establishing themselves on that basis. And I think because the regulatory community was sort of not up to understanding what was going on here, it was permitted. In the last few years, there has been an effort, an explicit effort by several of the major platform players to kind of cement that in. The handy laws that David references are now, and I believe 10 different states have passed laws that basically presumptively say if you deploy a workforce on a platform, they are therefore independent contractors. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say if you look at the law and the laws that my agency enforced, you would say that's goofy. That's a technical legal term. Because it doesn't comport to any of the ways we think about on any labor statutes what defines that. But independent contractors don't have worker compensation. They're not protected by, against sexual harassment. They don't get unemployment insurance. They're paid on a very different basis. And so there's a huge impact on public policies by this sort of de facto allowing this space to grow with the presumption of independent contracting. I think that's the kind of thing that we should lose sleep over and really think about where we need to go as those platforms do expand.
Interesting. So like what you're kind of saying is I actually feel like a problem is that kind of has been going on for 10, 20, 30 years, or an issue has been kind of outsourcing, franchising. You're more like, this is going to get radically accelerated further by this. So that's what got us up. Mary, what's got you up at night? And kind of maybe thinking like, if the end of work immediately is not our problem, what's over the horizon or what's happening right now that we should be concerned about?
Right. I mean, I think for me, after studying this for 5 years, it's that future has arrived. It isn't that we're waiting for the swell of the Fissured Workplace, is that now we have effectively ghost work supply chains. Like the labor that's out there, it's organizing around businesses that have effectively created products, services delivered to consumers that are service experiences, whether it's media or being able to offer you information at any hour or somebody to drop off food, that most of the services, the service economy, is being delivered through contract work, and everything is organized around that. So in other words, we don't have niche jobs being created. We've literally have the technology to dismantle employment as full-time employment. That's what keeps me up at night. Like full-time employment is a mirage. And I think if we look globally at the reality of informal economies effectively organizing most people's lives, most people do not go to a single workplace. That is not what the rest of the world looks like. The United States is starting to look like the rest of the world. I mean, almost half of our population has no employer-based benefits, even if they're working a wage job. So I feel like we keep holding up this idea that we're going to make it back to full-time employment if we just classify workers properly. No, we don't have a category for this kind of work that is task-based, project-based, organized around, I'm going to get this thing done, and then I'm going to go on and find another client who's going to give me another project, and I'll get that project done. That's what this world looks like. And I think if we asked many people who don't have full-time employment, what does your day job look like? They'd say, I have several different jobs I'm doing. I don't have one main job.
You're like, we don't have jobs anymore. We don't have niche jobs even. We have niche tasks.
Yeah,
and the automation is actually happening at the layer above, which is we're actually better automating the connecting of tasks together. And that's the automation that you're kind of concerned about. Maybe not the automation of your individual job. We can make that into a task that's like very, very simple and you get to plug into. But is it meaningful and does it provide you security? That part's disappearing.
And in fact, if you look at the tech sector, most of its focus is how can I create these technologies that will be able to further taskify projects. So their focus is, how do I build technology that's going to make it really easy for you to slice the paper you have to write, a report you have to write, into 3 different kinds of tasks, so that you can hand it off to 5 different people, maybe get some redundancy because you want to see the aggregate read of a copy edit of your paper, and that you will not be the person actually coordinating that labor. You are kind of on paper the employer, but that it's so distanced from you that you don't feel responsible.
Right.
We don't feel responsible to the people who produce most of the value in this service information economy.
Jason?
Right. So I guess I'd have 2 questions, Mary. I mean, one is, if you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he has this long description of the pin factory.
Yeah.
And the work in his pin factory is very divided up in a way that probably was less fun than the way people were making pins before that. But they produced a lot more pins, and they became a lot richer as a result. And a lot of our success over the last 200 years has been this type of specialization. And so the question is, if this is what gives people a better material standard, I think most people would rather have today's division of labor and today's material standard than make everything for themselves in the 1750s. So, why do we think, you sort of are, I feel, framing it as a bad thing. Why shouldn't we think of it as a good thing? And then the second question I'd have, just as someone who's not spent not spent the years you have, but look at the labor data, we do measure people who are working part-time, people who are working multiple jobs, people who are involuntarily part-time. They want a full-time job. All they can get is a part-time job. Those statistics haven't really risen or changed that dramatically.
So may I say to your first question, and you should probably take on the second, that we effectively, I don't think it's a bad thing that we're doing this. In fact, as an anthropologist, I can honestly say my job isn't necessarily to evaluate is it a good or bad thing. It's to observationally try and interrogate what's going on here and how do people make sense of what's going on. For many of the folks we worked with, this is an okay thing precisely because it gives them not flexibility. We should all really check ourselves when we use that language. It gives them control. And it's over their time. It gives them control over who they work with and what they work on. And it's almost always under these other constraints, childcare, elder care, other things they'd rather be doing. So folks turn to this work precisely because the service job that's full-time down the road is less attractive to them. It'll be a commute, and it won't work with the needs they have in the rest of their life. So it's not that this is a bad thing, it's that we have nothing built for this world.
Can I, before you get to the second question, I want to answer the first a little differently. And I should say, in our Washington days, we used to write regulations, and then Jason would send questions back that we had to answer about our damn regulations. So this is not much conjuring up old memories. No, I would make the following observation. The pin factory and the explosion of the manufacturing system that then followed in the 1800s created greater social wealth. It did not increase the wealth of the workers in those early factories. I mean, Karl Marx was a political economist who kind of came out of that early period of the growth of economic systems that were much more powerful than what they replaced. But it wasn't until you had the interventions of early trade unions, the growth of government policies around minimum wages and child labor and worker compensation that you had a shift. And these are social choices. I mean, I think that, again, is where we're at. It's every generation needs to grapple with how a changed economic system not only produces overall value, which is the aggregate productivity numbers, but it's also about how it shares. And I think that's the crisis we're in right now. We are not, we don't have a system that adequately, I think, protects.
Oh, and I strongly agree with that. I think I strongly agree with that. And that, I think, isn't rooted in technology. I mean, if you look across countries, there's some countries that have high employment rates, some that have low. some that have high wages, some that have low. The employment rates are totally unrelated to technology. The wages are somewhat related to technology, but with a strong mediation of those types of institutions like labor unions, minimum wage, and the like. So I think if you have an expanded division of labor, it gives you more possibilities and more options. And then what you do with those possibilities and options depends a lot on your policies in your institution. So I think it's sort of a good thing. It gives you better choices. That doesn't mean you're going to make and take advantage of one of the better options you now have.
But I think too, I agree with that, absolutely. And I don't think we have a really good sense of the head count of the people who are in the thick of this division of labor. And this division of labor is exponential in a way that we really don't have robust measurement according to the folks who ran the contingent worker survey. So I think we can all agree we don't actually know how many people do this kind of work because we don't have a way of categorizing and therefore counting this work. And particularly for organizing, that's the thing we should all be tracking. That if you don't have a shared workplace, and what the technology really does disrupt is an effective way of coordinating and collaborating, organizing to challenge your workplace if it's not treating you fairly, then we really have to think, okay, what are the consequences of our prosperity if we literally don't have the one linchpin we had for social welfare, which was organized labor that was site-based, employment-based. That's gone in this world.
So Jason, let me ask you, I felt you had a very profound statement at the beginning, which you said, like, yes, this is not new, and you're scared because we've not managed the previous ones well. So in the pen factory example, I feel like you're hearkening back to this is not new, but it also seems like you don't feel like we managed it well. I just look out in the audience, I have students, you have students out here, we're all expecting them to go out and think about these problems. What are the problems that they should be worried about to manage this better this time?
Yeah, I mean, so there's all these discussions, about the future of work that David talked about. And, part of me feels like things were changing just as fast 30 years ago, and we weren't having future of work dinners then. So why do we need to have them now? But then most of me thinks, wow, we should have been having these dinners 30 years ago. That just because we blew it then doesn't mean we should keep doing it now. So I think one thing is and this has even been a shift in my own thinking. I used to focus more on incomes. I think incomes are really important. I think jobs are really, really important. And inequality in terms of some people have jobs and some people don't, and then there's some people who have these in-between types of situations that Mary was talking about, I think is one of our most profound economic problems. The OECD used to have a labor strategy that said just get rid of labor unions, get rid of your minimum wage, get rid of rules that stop you from firing people. And if you do all of that, the market will work its magic and everyone who wants a job will have it. The country that came closest to following that advice was the United States. And employment rates for prime-age men and prime-age women in the United States are lower than they are in France, which didn't follow that advice. That doesn't mean we need to do the same thing that France did, but it certainly means we need to get out of this just knee-jerk ideological, if we just get out of the way, there'll be jobs there. So I think we need to be asking what we can do for there to be jobs. I think a lot of that is training and preparing people for those jobs. I think some of that is going to be making sure there are more jobs that different types of people can do, better connecting people to jobs, education systems, unions, apprenticeships, much better institutions for that in places like Germany than here. How do we replicate that? This is just sort of a sampling of the types of questions that I think we need to be asking and talking about and should have been talking about 30 years ago.
So in a few seconds, I'm going to go to the mics, and just so people know, we have microphones on either side of the room here, as well as some that are up there. Maybe as people may drift towards mics, and I do give a priority towards students, maybe first, David, could you talk to us a little bit like what's in the regulator and the government toolkit, both right now and then what could be in our toolkit, like what would require statutory change. And then Mary, maybe I'll turn to you and say a little bit the same, but also what's in the kind of technology toolkit? What should we be expecting of technology companies to do to think differently about this space?
So what's in our toolkit now, and this was something we thought a lot about in the Labor Department during the Obama administration. We had a Congress that wasn't exactly, let us say, cooperative with any broader change. So certainly in my agency and other agencies in the Labor Department, we thought hard about how do you actually administer things like child labor and minimum wage laws in a world where the party that might be violating the law, and you might collect, let's say, back wages owed because people have been violating minimum wage and overtime, might not be really a party that's really causing the problem. It might be some subcontractor that's being paid a very low price for doing that work. And unless you think about things like joint employment or somehow moving up the chain, you know, we had a mantra at Wage and Hour Division, and it was focus at the top, which was sort of just think about industry structure and where some of the pressure needs to be traced back to. And we had regulatory tools to do that. We dusted off some tools that had never been used before, hadn't been applied in some industries. There's something called the hot goods provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act, was introduced at the time when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the late 30s. It was built around the garment industry. We applied it in the agricultural industry. I had 2 of the longest hours of my life in front of an ag committee where I united Democrats and Republicans in their common hatred of me of doing that. But the idea was farm workers are often paid by a farm labor contractor who is at the bottom of a very complicated chain. And unless you sort of fix not only the wage but the pricing system upward, you're never going to change the situation on the ground. So I think we had traction under existing laws to an extent. But I think a lot of our laws do make presumptions that the employment relationship is a simple kind of, there's an employer and there's an employee, and that's the way they were written largely in that world, with some exceptions. And I think we have to go back to the question of, we know that no longer characterizes so much of our society. I think we need to think about how then do we fashion responsibility. How do we go back to basic questions about what kinds of basic rights should people have, whether they're an independent contractor or an employee or something else? What are those core rights that we need to assure? How do we go and do that? And then you can kind of go outward in concentric circles. What are the kind of benefits we want to make sure people have in a world where they're going to be moving around more? What are the kinds of rights we still need to vest in employment? We have to go back to some pretty first principle discussions of those issues.
Interesting. Okay.
So we interviewed hundreds of people. We surveyed thousands more, and working across 2 countries. And the thing that was the most common need, it wasn't a technological need. It wasn't a tech fix. It was benefits. It was thinking, don't assume I have health care because I have a specific employer. Fundamentally, you know, the number of people we spoke with who really could not count on access to care, let alone insurance. It wasn't that surprising, but at the same time, thinking about the consequences of that if, for example, your workplace is the home office that you set up on your own dime. Like that's a public health tsunami that could hit us if we think about the numbers of people who are effectively their own OSHA, who are making sure their workplace is safe. There's nobody responsible for that right now. So when I think about the tech sector and the Uberization of any service that could be provided to you, like that's where most of the startups are at. It's trying to find what's called a human in the loop. It's not to get automation, to get the person out of the loop. It's literally, how can I have a person who's part of some sort of technical automated process, and they're going to be able to deliver something to an end user that is effective and affordable, precisely because it's that sweet mix of tech and a person making a judgment that only a person can effectively do. Like, that's the future of work. So thinking about how would we actually move away from, I'd really challenge that framework of between jobs that Jason put on the table, or even imagining that we know what kinds of learning are necessary when we don't have a label for people who classify labels. Like, that's not a work identity. That the most important thing that we could offer is to think about what are the benefits that are going to support a labor commons that every company, whether it's a huge company like Microsoft or a startup, is going to be drawing from. And their goal is, I'm going to draw on those people and I'm going to get rid of them as quickly as I can because I want to create a service that can keep up with consumer demand. Like, what does it look like to provide the basics of continuing education, healthcare, leave, that are assuming that nobody's between jobs. They're literally working all the time. But that, of course, to have a healthy workforce and to have a healthy commons, you'd have to be feeding it. Technology isn't going to be the fix for that.
A few thoughts before we go to questions. One is, I do remember, I think it was Andy McAfee, I was down at MIT saying, how many jobs have actually been automated? If you look at the census, they track jobs people have, how many jobs have been automated out of existence, and so you go, look, how many jobs have ever been removed from the census because it's like clearly they don't exist anymore. It's actually very hard to find. Most jobs are composed of lots of tasks and you don't automate them all. I think the only one they could find was like elevator bell, like the bell elevator, like the guy who presses the buttons for you, that one was gone. But so it's actually suggests this is much harder to do.
Yes.
I think possibly in response to Jason's question of why, the thing that has me worried about why we weren't talking about this 30 years ago is what I find fascinating about this panel is so many of the issues actually are quite old. Yeah. There are issues of outsourcing, there are issues of kind of creating tasks and like pushing workers out of the organization, and those are not new issues. Yeah. They're just getting accelerated as a result of the technology. And maybe we weren't having these conversations 30 years ago because there were people at the top who were benefiting, and they were living great lives, and the people at the very bottom, there weren't enough of them, and we just didn't care. And that's worth maybe looking back and trying to think about that a little bit more carefully.
Yeah, I mean, if you asked people in 1939 to predict what employment would be like now, one thing they would have gotten wrong was they would have predicted there was no one whose jobs was labeling labels or whatever those jobs are. In fact, if you had asked me an hour ago, I'm not sure I would have known that. So they would have missed all those people. They would have also, if you'd asked them to guess the number of people who were working as waiters, waitresses in hotels, they would have probably been about 9 million people short of the true number. They would have been shocked by all the apps on our phone and people who have jobs making those apps. They also would have been shocked by how much we're eating out in restaurants, staying in hotels, and those are very labor-intensive services, which is to say, part of why we have employment is because people get richer, they buy more stuff. That creates these new types of jobs. It creates a lot of old types of jobs as well. I think a lot of the benefits issues that Mary, I think, has very correctly identified can be solved by continuing the project that we've done since the 1930s. Social Security is portable retirement benefits. Medicare and Medicaid for some segments of the population were portable health benefits, and then for a larger set with the Affordable Care Act. If we had paid leave that was a tax, paid tax in, you got leave out, that would be disconnected from a job. So I think a lot of this is not trying to figure out how these jobs can have benefits, it's trying to figure out how people can have benefits without having them through these jobs, and moving away from the employer system, at least as an option for a lot of people in a lot of these respects. And that's something we've done since Bismarck.
Yeah, I often wonder how much more labor mobility there is in a country like Canada where people's healthcare goes with them versus like Americans who I meet who are terrified to leave their job because they'll lose it, which is, creates, I think, really benefits employers.
Yep.
Let's go to some questions. So a couple of rules on questions. Please say your name and say what school you're affiliated with or what you are studying, but keep it brief. And then your question should be concise. It should be short. It should end with your voice going up because you're asking a question and not a statement with your voice going down, and no statements with what do you think about that at the end. So let's be concise. Ask a very precise question. Let's open with you, sir, up at the top.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Andre. I'm a mid-career student here, the Master in Public Administration on a Harvard Kennedy School. I'm interested on just transitions, and we were just now debating about regulation and the role of government and also of corporations. I would be particularly interested on knowing the opinion of the panel on what is the role, the responsibility of investors to invest in the communities that are left behind in these transitions, even if we have a net positive creation of jobs. What is the role of the investors with the pitch?
Anybody want to take a first crack?
I can take a swing because one of the companies we started, that we studied is a startup. And part of the value proposition of that company is as a benefits corporation, which some people would say that's not that meaningful. But it meant that the investors who were backing Lead Genius, which effectively you could call it the new ambulance chaser of this generation. Like one of the things they do is generate for law offices a list of people who are in public postings for things they've done, like perhaps drinking under the influence. And then they can go to those people who are listed in the paper and say, hey, it looks like you need your identity cleaned up. That's an example. But that business is thriving, providing sales leads, and its investors are particularly drawn to that company because they are not selling themselves as simply software. They're presenting themselves very clearly as a service that's augmented by collective human intelligence. And that part of the value of that company is to be able to nurture that pool. Just say you're going to constantly need people coming back to do that. It's not a race to the bottom for that company. So, investors really looking to care about feeding this commons and making it sustainable rather than getting any cent they can, arguably are going to save themselves the pain and wrath that companies like Uber see today. So, investors would be wise to kind of move towards the B Corp.
I am a little bit more sympathetic to companies should maximize profits because that's what they do. I have even greater conviction around the view that companies could care less what anyone who sits here in the Kennedy School and opines on what companies should do, and that that's what they're going to do is something relatively close to maximizing profits, maybe plus or minus with a thumb on the scale for some things that their customers like or help them retain their employees. Used to be that maximizing profits meant you went to a lower wage state to set up your factory because you could hire people more cheaply, and that actually spread prosperity and made lower income states grow more quickly. Now that mostly means, and there may be some examples to the contrary, but it mostly means going to Massachusetts, the Boston area, to the Bay Area, to the New York area, to the Washington, D.C. area, as we saw with Amazon, because it turns out that the cheapest workers isn't what's most important. It's proximity to other really high-paid, talented workers that is. And so I think if we expect companies to solve this, it's not going to be solved. And rather than sort of hoping they do and praying they do and trying to find some small examples of them doing it, I think this is a job for public policy and for government, because almost all of the corporate incentives, I think, go the wrong way, and I think corporations follow their incentives.
I totally agree with that point, and I am also skeptical about how much sort of capital seeing the bigger picture is going to help us. And I'll give you the example again, I talked about it before in terms of the platform economy. I had, when I was in my former position, discussions with a bunch of venture capital people in California about this whole issue of the platform economy. And the message coming out of that discussion and from other things that I heard from actually companies who were starting in that space was one of the worst things you could do if you went to a venture company was to present a business model that included the word employees. So the venture money was using that as a criteria, essentially of saying, are you a successful company? So there were companies that were setting up and that have set up profitably as employee base. There's a company called Honor that does home health care that knew, because of the importance of having people, trusted people going into into someone's home to care for a loved one, you needed to make sure you really owned that person or had certified that person. They had a hell of a time trying to find venture money because of basically the notion that, hey, this doesn't seem to be the way that these models work and that we make profits in this industry. That's, again, I agree with Jason. If you don't get in front of that problem in terms of public policies that are fashioned, then your public policies get shaped by where the capital markets push them.
Well, can I say, it's both and. We absolutely need the regulation because no company's just going to do it for kindness. But for the investor who's smart, they'll put money on the company that's saying, actually, I care about the people who are producing value for me. They don't want to call them employees. That's, it's much sexier to sell software than a staffing temp agency. But it's really a good bet if you're looking to place a bet. Find the company that is doing right by doing good. Because that is the thing that anybody around them is going to start sorting. Like, yeah, I don't want to be the Uber, I want to be the Lyft. So the shift there is something to watch.
Yeah, the only caution is would there be Lyft without Uber?
No.
So
duopolies are necessary.
My name is Noah Sleeper. I have no affiliation with the school. I'm curious, so you've sort of talked about labor in general, but I'm curious what effect you see this having on underrepresented or underserved minorities who are kind of already having an issue in the labor force. Is this going to be exacerbated? Are there any current efforts or plans to mitigate the effect that this change in labor will have on them?
Yeah, that's great.
David, you want to go first?
Well, I can certainly speak to that, particularly from lessons of the older Fissured Workplace, where you have a lot of the work that gets shifted out sometimes from the main company to staffing agencies or subcontractors. There is a real risk that what you get there also is a segregation of people by demographic groups. So you have concentrated, we saw this, for instance, in enforcement work we did in the vast poultry industry. There is something called catcher positions, and catchers are people who it is the most god-awful work you can imagine. You run around literally catching chickens and stuffing them in bags, and you're paid on a piece rate basis. This work is done by independent contractor structures who work for major poultry companies, and it is very much made up of immigrant workers and therefore an occupationally segregated group. And you risk that in a lot of these setups. Mary would know more about in some of the ghost work setups if you're seeing sort of similar things. But I mean, we certainly saw a lot of evidence of that segregation leading to worse outcomes for groups that already were disadvantaged by access to benefits, wage rates, and occupational hazards.
Yeah.
Mary, this feels like, for me, I remember there's a New York Times article that I saw about a year ago, which had two women side by side, one who had been a cleaner in a company and was now an executive, I believe, and the other was her kind of the person now, and she was contracted out, and there was never going to be that ladder for her. Yeah. This feels like it kind of ties into...
No, absolutely, and it speaks to everything that Jason and David are saying about this history of moving toward, and particularly David's book, Fissured Workplace, to see how much the dismantling of the workplace and pretty much moving as much as possible to contract labor, that really was the breaking down of a career ladder that would have allowed anybody to move up. So then this is what's odd to me about the research that we've done, is we see both, an overwhelming number, a good 70% of the people in our research project had higher education or had bachelor's degrees. These are educated people. The one thing that was noteworthy was the number of them who were first generation college educated. That was both in the United States and India, telling us what they didn't have to weather the Great Recession were the social ties. They weren't the people who went to Harvard. They were the people who went somewhere else, to a public university or a community college. So if you don't have those social ties, you don't have that net worth, odds are pretty good you're not going to weather a challenging job market. So in some ways, that's what's happening here. We've got a split labor market of folks who are less employed or folks who are already marginalized being pushed into these settings. And the oddly hopeful note we saw, the number of people who felt marginalized by formal employment, whether because they had different abilities, people who were uncomfortable in certain settings, just in terms of their mental health, folks of color who felt that they were alienated in their workplace, who gravitated to this work, stuck with this work, precisely because it meant they could control who they worked with, when they worked, and what they worked on. So it became this opportunity that is absolutely a diagnosis of what's unhealthy about our formal employment environment. That if we were actually enforcing the laws we have, perhaps that wouldn't be true. Again, as an anthropologist, I'm really looking at how are things, what are the realities people are living. Not, I would love that to not be true, but there are definitely people who are moving into this world to contend with being marginalized in formal employment, and they're further marginalized in this employment.
Let's go to this mic, Adam.
Hi, Adam Hawksby, second year Master in Public Policy student at the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask about industrial policy, and there seems to be a kind of growing trend around the world, certainly in the UK and the US, for cities to put together industrial strategies, local economic strategies, inclusive growth strategies. And I guess given there are concerns about some of the jobs developing organically or maybe mistakes made in industrial shifts in the past, what's the role of either nation states or cities or regional leadership in directing economies, either through public investment or through sponsoring certain challenges or certain areas of growth?
Yeah. Jason,
I'd say,
yeah, let's go.
Yeah, I mean, I'd first of all distinguish between two questions. One is you're the mayor of a city. Should you adopt this strategy? The second is you're the president of the country. Should you want every mayor adopting this strategy? I think the answer to the first may be yes, that you should try to be the person that offers the incentives to get the Amazon to locate in your city rather than the other guy's city. But that collectively there's only, you can't have 80 different biotechnology hubs and everyone wants to have one. And so a little bit of, and then a lot of rents then end up getting shifted to the employers who are mobile and can choose between these 80 places and get to capture a lot of it. So I think a certain amount of mutual disarmament would be beneficial to all of us. Maybe we'd miss out on a few good strategies that way, but I think there's far more money spent just on rents. In terms of an industrial strategy, I think, insofar as you're going to have ones that are a little bit more technology neutral, you're going to have a subsidy for whoever can figure out a car that can do blank, not a car that does it with electricity, with hydrogen, with whatever else. So things that are a little bit more creating an incentive to innovate in a direction you want innovation without saying how you accomplish that goal. So if you have to have one, at least be technology neutral.
Could I pick that up? Because it's, the conclusion of our book has quite a number of recommendations, and one of the ones that made the most sense, and there are a few pilot efforts of this, is to think about the municipal setting as a test bed. And the difference it could make, for example, to reimagine the Chamber of Commerce. That the main street, the kinds of investments you make in your local community might have a lot to do with thinking of that independent contractor as the self-employed business that would have been the business you would have invested in to move on to Main Street. Or to rethink co-working spaces entirely. So going back to my example of the home office setup that looks like a disaster waiting to happen, move a lot of the money we spend at the municipal level training people to do completely outdated and useless resumes, and use that money to be able to create co-working spaces that are municipally backed, that have internet connectivity, because the thing we haven't talked about at all is that if we're thinking about digital economies, it's really a problem if we're not thinking about digital infrastructure. So municipalities could absolutely be the center of gravity for job growth and certainly job access if it was thinking, oh, that's what Main Street needs. And it hasn't quite made that adjustment, but there's a lot of possibility there to be tapped.
Yeah, and what's I think interesting too is like the chambers of commerce now represent a very different type of organization than they did 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely.
Now they represent more kind of an elite executive with maybe a creative class, but everything else been outsourced.
Yeah.
So they have less need to articulate the needs of those people even in their own work.
Yeah.
Let's go over here, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for great conversation. My name is Najm Meshkati. I'm a professor of engineering at USC and a fellow with managing the Atom Project at Belfer Center. I really appreciated the conversation. I've been reading a new book lately, which is very much related to the title of this session. It's called Robot Proof, Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It's by Dr. Joseph Aoun, who is the president of Northeastern University, a big visionary for those of us that were in higher education. Joseph talks about robot-proof jobs in general and the robot-proof jobs in higher education. I would like to hear from the panel, what do you consider as a robot-proof job in future?
All service work. One of the hardest things to do is anticipate what somebody wants and address it and doing it in a caring way. That's actually why folding laundry is really hard for a robot. Caring for your parents will be really hard. We know that an aging population, one of the most likely occupations that will grow is care work. That is incredibly hard technically, you know this, very hard technically to turn into a computational process that can be automated. Because the idea of sensing something and addressing it, preempting what it is that somebody wants, very hard. So anybody doing service work, your barber, the person taking care of
moderating panels. Moderating panels.
Moderating panels.
That can probably be substituted.
Well,
I don't know.
that could be distributed globally, so that it wouldn't have to be just 1,000 Davids.
Yeah, I mean, just to Mary's point, if you look at the top four projected, the growth, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out projections every few years, so the latest one is for 2016 to 2026. And the top four occupations that are, in terms of just sheer numbers, are all the kinds of care jobs that that Mary's talking about. So, and those are things I agree are very hard to automate. Let me just say something about, and I thought you were going a bit in a different direction with higher education. I sometimes think of the fissured work as almost the canary in the mine before you move something to robotics or towards one of the things that the panel, the name of our session is built around. And so where you see, before you see actually automation, I mean, Uber found the kind of way of using people long before they're going to have fleets of autonomous vehicles. I think, Amazon talked about drones delivering packages, but the real Amazon story is Amazon Flex, which is a way of doing direct delivery, again, through independent contracting.
Which is more drivers than Lyft.
It's a huge number of drivers. Right. I mean, think about replacing retail jobs with people bringing packages to your store. That's a lot of people and hard to automate. In the academy, we have these things called, and I'm saying this I run a school called adjunct faculty, where we have essentially shifted away a lot of the responsibilities we used to have from hiring faculty people. We have things called tenure postdocs. Postdocs were developed to be 3- and 4-year propositions, not permanent kinds of job situations. So again, I think if we say, where should we be worried about, it's kind of those antecedents to robotics, as opposed to ultimately the jobs that go completely
so there's almost like there's going to be like a spike in demand, but that suggests that maybe there's going to be a collapse. Jason, you kind of said we're terrible at predicting like our our 1950s ancestors were like the terrible job predicting things. Do you have any thoughts, or are you too nervous?
So yes, if I was forced to predict, I'd make the same prediction Mary and David made. But the second thing I'd say is don't be too overconfident about your ability to predict. That same BLS survey in the mid-1990s predicted the fastest growing occupation, or one of the fastest growing was travel agents. And right before they were all destroyed. And in general, the more education you get, the more future-proofed you are. What that education is matters, but more makes it more likely you're going to be doing something creative, managerial, interpersonal, involving judgment, all sorts of things that will make you less replaceable. And that I'm not 100% confident in, but more confident in than any particular job.
So I am cognizant of time, but what I'd love to do is maybe just have a closing comment from each one of you. Again, everybody here in the room obviously cares about, is concerned about this issue, maybe not from the individual perspective of you worry about your job, although maybe you should be more nervous than you are, but more about how are we going to build a society where there is meaningful work. So what's the kind of policy advice, or what's the reading list, or what's the kind of type of thinking you think students need to have in order to help create the type of world that we'd like to create? Maybe let's start on the far side, Jason, and work ourselves this way.
I guess I just, I brought up examples from the 1770s through the recent present. And I think the future, just because it's hard to predict, the past we can at least study and look at the data and know about. And so trying to learn that pretty well, I don't think it'll give you a perfect prediction of the future, but I think it'll be better than just sort of random speculation in the absence of everything. And I think that lesson tells us that the most important thing is actually not technology. It's what you're studying here, which is public policy. And that tells us how we're going to channel those technologies, use those technologies, and a lot about the impact they'll have on our lives.
Dana.
So when I walked in before the session, Jason looked at me and he said, someone talking about the future of work with a tie is going to sort of undercut their credibility. But with that caveat, as stated, I think I would go back to say we really do need to think hard about which part of the choices that ultimately result or that allow technologies to move forward are social choices or nested in larger policy choices. I think it is too easy. I don't think it's been part of this discussion, but in many of these discussions, there's this kind of techno-determinism that falls into it, and we miss the institutional and the public policy role, which is obviously something that all of you spend a lot of time thinking about and are crucial to thinking about this topic.
I guess I'd say people make meaning out of what they do. Doesn't really matter who we talked with. It didn't matter how often they'd say, yes, I can get bored or frustrated with what I'm doing. If they were talking about the moment they were pulling content that they thought might be objectionable, they had a way of making sense of what they were doing and finding it meaningful. And I think the greatest challenge in front of all of us is to value what they're contributing to us, to see what they do as meaningful and important, and to care, not because they have a degree or don't, but to be able to see they're contributing value to our lives. How do we support anybody who's doing that? What does that look like? To organize how we support employment around the fundamental principle that people are contributing to society when they're working, and to sustain them is the most effective way to guarantee or creating any sort of robot-proof world. It's really about creating some sense that you would do that job. Imagining that there will be folks who will take care of a job you don't want to do is not a very good way to build the future.
What I've always loved when I talk with you, Mary, is how much you complexify this story and say a lot of people want to say, oh, a lot of this work is drudgery work, or it's not. But actually, a lot of people find real meaning in this work, and we shouldn't talk about it in those terms. Yeah. And a lot of time, this work, while there may be difficult things about it, it sometimes gives people power and agency, control over their lives. Like Uber drivers who say, yeah, I could do other things, but I like doing this because I'm my own boss and choose my own hours at time, and that actually gives them power. And so part of it, I think the challenge is how do we figure out what makes this work for people and bring strength to that, and what do we figure out is not working for people, and figure out what the kind of the policy response is going to be. And I love Jason's comment of, I'm very worried about techno-determinism. Well, governments are very powerful, and they have real agency, and his message, I think, is so powerful in that you have an opportunity to help create the world. We do not have to simply let it happen to us. And as someone who's trained as a historian, the thing that I really take away is I do really dislike when we talk about these things as being something fundamentally new that we've never seen before. Then we end up kind of feeling we're in the ocean, we're cast adrift, we have no reference points. And I think that creates an undue amount of fear that's not fair and not real. In fact, when you can look back at historical examples, it allows us to ground ourselves and say, a lot of this we've been through before. Maybe we didn't handle it well, but we can learn from the past. And so I think there's a real value in going back and looking at what we have done, because I strongly suspect that somewhere between 50 and 70% we've seen this before. And so it's not all new, but it's definitely not all old, but we can learn from the past. And so maybe some of us should be spending more time looking at history books to figure out how we should move forward around this type of work. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and please give me a warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you. Now is your opportunity to potentially mob them and ask a couple of questions, and so I'll sacrifice them at this point.